Well, I'm sorry about my emails earlier. How many emails did you get from me? 3. Well, I didn't notice. I had a meeting with Fan, and then Fan said, "Oh, there is a class tomorrow." No, it's today. What did I say? You said tomorrow. Okay. And then is the class starting at 12:55? I was like, what? Did I say that? Because yes, you did. Like, oh no. Yeah, I don't know what got into me. Just was not focused. So anyway, so the exam is up on Canvas, so you can start working on it. And I was going to say there are reading material. I don't know if you've noticed, other than the lecture material, I open up reading material. For example, in soy protein lecture, I had 2 papers that I've used, or 3 papers that I've used. They are there, and when I've read those papers, I underline the important information that you might find relevant. So it would be good to look at those as well as you study and prepare for the exam. Anyway, studying is good because the final exam is cumulative. So you really want to start with that as well. Okay. So we don't have a presentation today, so I will be hopefully starting and finishing serial proteins and start the last section, which is protein modification. Because we lost a week, so we are not doing the in-class exam and we're not doing the in-class egg protein. What I'll do is I'm going to post the recorded lecture from last year on egg proteins. I would suggest that you listen to it, familiarize yourself with it. In the final, there won't be a lot of focus on egg proteins. I'm just going to tell you that. But there might be a random question that will be good to listen to it, but I won't focus on it.
So since it won't be covered in class, would that question then be more of a general idea, or would it still be a little more specific?
It won't be very specific, and if it might be a true and false question. Yeah, I just want you to at least hear that lecture. Yeah. Okay. Alrighty. Cereal proteins. You might want to fill Lisa on what I just said, Katie, later. Okay. Just what do we know about ascorbic acid? When we add ascorbic acid to flour, we add it for a reason. What do you think happens? Yes, Lucy?
A and C?
Exactly. So, addition of ascorbic acid strengthens the gluten upon kneading and promotes disulfide interchange. How does it function? How does it do that? As what kind of agent? Well, ascorbic acid is a reducing agent, but when you add it to flour and then water, and you start kneading in oxygen and water, what happened to ascorbic acid? It becomes an oxidizing agent because it gets oxidized to anhydroascorbic acid. Dehydroascorbic acid, sorry, not anhydro. Dehydroascorbic acid, which is the oxidized form of ascorbic acid, which acts as an oxidizing agent promoting disulfide interchange. Okay, what do we know about glass transition? What is glass transition? What is the definition of glass transition? Simple term. Something is transitioning. Ah, Dr. Labuja would be not happy with you.
Something to do with like the amorphous structure. Switching.
Well, there is an amorphous, there is crystalline, there is glassy state to rubbery state, right? So it's changing from glassy state to rubbery state or crystalline to amorphous, right? Circle? Okay. So basically this is the change that the gluten-forming protein has to go through in order to become rubbery. That means it can be adjusted and bending and stretching in order to form your gluten matrix. So the glass transition occurs under what conditions? Yes, Becky? B is correct, and also C is correct. So definitely if you don't have moisture, you really need higher temperature, or if you really have no moisture at all, that will be really hard to get over glass transition. But if you heat under low moisture conditions, you can achieve glass transition. And at room temperature under moist conditions, especially for gluten-forming proteins, can pass the glass transition or reach glass transition. And then I have a question for you. Is there gluten in wheat? No. Where is gluten? In the dough. There is no gluten. Gluten is the structure that gluten-forming proteins form. So you have different proteins in flour, and when you mix them with water, they form gluten. Gluten is the matrix. Okay. So this is one of the students from a couple of years ago made that graph for me, and then it looks much nicer than the one I had before. And then Nina made a little graph for me and got the extra points for it, for the soy protein structure. So I encourage you, if you see an old figure that is crabby, you can make me a figure and get extra points. So anyway, this is just FYI. I'm not expecting you to learn any of this, but these are your different cereal grains that come from, obviously, some are related, same tribe, and it's just an informational kind of overview of the grains. And here's a table with the composition of the different grains, and you'll notice here that the protein is not really high in cereal grains. It ranges between 7 to 12 or 14% protein, so it's really not a great, they're not a great source of protein. And most importantly, they're deficient in what amino acid? What's the limiting? Lysine. So cereal grains are often deficient in lysine. So they are not really that great nutrition-wise in terms of source of protein. However, some cereal grains are used for their functionality, especially wheat, for the quality of baked products. So in cereal proteins are classified mostly, you have albumins, but we don't see it here, which is low percentage, but you have globulins, and what we learned from plant protein globulins, you have the 7S and the 11S, same as what we learned in terms of the legumes. But in addition, there is a very important class of protein, which is the prolamines. You know why they are called prolamines? Have you learned this anywhere before? They're high in proline and glutamine. So hence they're called prolamines. And under prolamine, there are two categories: general prolamines and then prolamine superfamily. So you can see here, there's the triticale. The triticale has barley, wheat, rye, and wheat. And for each one of those, you have the unique prolamine groups. So barley, you have hordein, rye, secalin, and then for wheat you have the gliadin and the glutenin. Glutenin is high molecular weight prolamine, okay? And it's also referred to in some literature as glutelin, under glutelin groups. So sometimes it's listed as a prolamine, sometimes it's listed as glutenin. So it depends on the source. So, but glutenin is a high prolamine, high molecular weight prolamine, is a polymetric protein. It's large molecular weight. Polymeric protein. Let's see. So the globulins, for example, 7S in the grain, they're mostly located in the embryo or the germ or the aileron layer, which is the bran layer that is closest to the endosperm. So the rest of them, you can find globulins a little bit in the endosperm, but most of the proteins in the endosperm are your prolamins. So the prolamin protein dominates the protein classes in wheat, if we're talking about wheat right now. Tryptophan, which is a globulin, is a minor constituent in the endosperm. And the proteins in wheat has this very, the prolamins specifically in wheat have this very characteristic functionality, which is the viscoelastic property, which is very unique to wheat. So upon kneading and forming a dough, they are storage protein because that's the source of nutrients during germination, source of amino acid during germination. So they're called storage proteins, and they form the network that results in an elastic or viscoelastic property of the dough that allows the retention of gas. And because of this property, it's used in a range of baked products, as you all know, the bread, pasta, cookies, cakes, pancakes, pastries, etc. So in wheat, you're very familiar with the different types of wheat. You have the hard wheat that is usually used for bread. Durum is a very hard wheat type of wheat, and then it has higher protein content, 13 to up to 15% of protein, and it's used for pasta specifically. The hard wheat is usually anywhere between 10 to 13%, on average 12%, and then the soft variety of wheat usually has 8 to 11%, and they're all used for different purposes. So the soft wheat, it has about 8 to 11%, so it's not just lower protein content, it has different ratios of the different proteins in the wheat. So we'll learn a little bit more about gliadins and glutenins. Here the ratio of gliadin to glutenin was higher than the ratio of gliadin to glutenin in hardwood wheat. And glutenins, we'll learn that they are more the elastic or responsible for the elastic properties, and the gliadins are responsible for the viscosity. So here we have higher ratio of gliadin to glutenin than here. And another feature which makes the hard red wheat hard and the soft red wheat soft is the friabolin proteins, or otherwise known as pyrindolins. These proteins, there are two main types of them, pin A and pin B. They are associated with the starch in the endosperm. If they are present, then they provide that softness, or they cause the softness of the grain. So presence of pin A or pin B or both result in soft wheat. Absence of both or one of them will result in hard red wheat. So there is a research that was going on in our lab looking at a type of wheat with pyrindolins knocked out and looking at how the hardness changes. It goes from soft to hard once these genes are knocked out, and the gliadin to glutenin ratio also differs. So we were looking at the relationship of these pyrindolins to the ratio of gliadins to glutenin ratio in those wheats. So in terms of distribution of protein in the different components, so we have the germ, we have the endosperm, and we have the bran layer. So in the bran, we have about 15% protein, and the protein that comes from the bran represents 20% of the the total protein from the entire grain. And the germ is high in protein as well, it's about 26%. However, since the germ is tiny, obviously it contributes only to 8% of the total kernel protein. And then the bulk of the protein is in the endosperm, and the endosperm, however, is starchy, so the protein percent is about 10%, and the rest is starch. And that 10% protein, given that it is the bigger portion of the grain, represents 72% of the total kernel protein. So the different proteins in the grains are, in wheat specifically, they are distributed into different classes. We have the albumin, the globulin, prolamine, and butylin, or high molecular weight prolamins. So Osborne fractionation, I'm not sure if you heard about Osborne fractionation. Have you? Some of you might have. Osborne is the guy that fractionated different proteins in grains and used different solutions to fractionate them. We found that when you solubilize with water, you are able to solubilize the albumins. And then if you have salt in there, globulins will be soluble. And then if you add alcohol, 70% alcohol, the prolamins are soluble. However, the high molecular weight prolamins are not soluble. So what you do to solubilize the high molecular weight prolamins, you add either acid or base, a detergent or urea, but in the lab we use acid and we add a reducing agent because the high molecular weight prolamins are polymeric proteins and they are linked together via disulfide linkages. So they won't be extracted unless you break down those disulfide linkages. So in order to extract and solubilize the high molecular weight prolamins, which are polymeric proteins, you add a reducing agent and acid to aid in the solubilization. And we'll talk about fractionation later on of those proteins. So albumins and globulins of the grain is of wheat specifically, they're mostly cytoplasmic and membrane proteins, and their function are mostly as metabolic or hydrolytic enzymes necessary for germination. So they're not storage proteins, they don't have any functionality contribution, or they can also be enzyme inhibitors. So these are the main functions of albumins and globulins, and they are mostly, especially globulin 7S, and then albumins are mostly located in the germ and the bran portion. Now the prolamins and butylins, or high molecular weight prolamins, are mostly located or are located in the endosperm. And they are the gluten-forming proteins. So they are storage proteins, they are the source of amino acid and nitrogen during germination, and they are known as structural proteins. So some characteristics for albumins and globulins, they are high in basic amino acids, so they're mostly charged, and therefore they're more soluble in water and salt. And they do have high amount of cysteine as well. Whereas prolamine and butylin, and again, butylin is high molecular weight prolamins, they are really high in glutamine and proline, and that's hence the name prolamins. Glutamine is really high in concentration, it's about 30 to 40% of the protein, and it's responsible for the formation of hydrogen bonding. So the stabilization of the beta sheet in the gluten network comes from the high concentration of glutamine. So they have very low amount of charged amino acids, so they're not high in basic or acidic, hence they're not very soluble. They have low density charge, therefore they're not soluble under neutral conditions. They're not really high in cysteine, however, the high molecular weight glutenins or high molecular weight prolamins have their cysteine groups strategically located at the terminus So they are present at the extremities of the chain of the protein, which makes it easier to form the disulfide linkages and form these large polymers. So the gluten matrix is made up of gliadin and glutenin. And within the gliadins, we have 4 different gliadins. So we have alpha, beta, gamma, and omega gliadins. They are monomeric. That means they do not form disulfide linkages and form a polymeric protein. They are a monomeric protein, about 40 kilodalton in size, and that's the average. And all of the cysteine residues in the alpha, beta, and gamma gliadins form intra-chain disulfide. That means within that one monomeric protein. Therefore, they don't form the polymeric protein. The omega specifically lacks cysteine, so the omega gliadin does not take part in disulfide linkages. So the gliadin is responsible for the viscosity or the extensibility of the gluten matrix. The glutenin, or the high molecular weight prolamins, is a polymeric protein. So each monomer is about, on average, 68 to 88 kilodalton. And then they form disulfide linkages interchain. That means within the different chains, they form disulfide linkages, hence the polymeric nature of the protein. So we have 2 types of glutenins, high molecular weight and low molecular weight glutenins, but they are associated via disulfide linkages forming the high molecular weight polymeric proteins. So in general, glutenins have 3 domains, a central domain and the N-terminal and C-terminal domain. The central domain, these are the different amino acids that are repetitive. So Q is, you see there's a lot of Q. The Q is the glutamine, P for proline, glycine, serine, and tryptophan and tyrosine. Anyway, so these are when we say repetitive, so the domain in the middle, you have a repetitive sequence of these amino acids. And that sequence can go between 440 to 680 residues. And then the N and C terminals contains most of the cysteine present in that protein, with exception with 1 cysteine residue in the repetitive domain. So most of the cysteine is in your C terminal and N terminal, which facilitate disulfide linkages between these molecules. So when we run them on the gel, we always run under reducing conditions, because if we don't run under reducing conditions, we won't be able to see the different monomers, because they are, especially the glutenins are linked via disulfide linkages. So if we don't reduce, they will be all up here and won't be able to see them. So when we reduce the sample and run it on a gel, so you will see the high molecular weight glutenin region is over there. The omega gliadin, here we have low molecular weight glutenins, and in this region we have the gliadins plus some low molecular weight glutenins in the same region. So when we form the dough, that means adding the water and start kneading, we get the gluten matrix, which the gluten is a combination of gliadin intertwined with glutenin. And we'll talk about the means of interaction, but one most common one is the formation of disulfide linkages. So once you're kneading, you're opening up the structure and exposing the different molecules to each other and exposing or causing disulfide interchange, breaking disulfide bond and rearranging them so that the gliadin is interacting with the glutenin, and different glutenin molecules are also interacting with each other, forming the gluten network. So, given their low concentration of basic and acidic amino acid, they are not soluble in the range of pH 6 to 9. However, at very low pH, gluten proteins may become moderately soluble, and at high pH as well. As we knead the flour, also a buildup of beta sheets start occurring, which is the secondary structure not only within the protein itself, the one molecule, but across different molecules. So beta sheets start forming across different molecules, given the high concentration of gluten. And when beta sheets forms, it also brings into proximity the sulfidyl groups so that they can form SS linkages. So some research has looked into what causes the formation of gluten network. Is it more the disulfide bonds or is it more the beta sheet? And they found through research and experimentation that the formation of beta sheet drives the formation of disulfide linkages. So beta sheet happens first and bring the proteins in close proximity to each other, facilitating disulfide linkages. So once that gluten is formed, it's a very unique macropolymer. It is insoluble and it has a very characteristic viscoelastic property. Another mechanism for formation of gluten is tyrosine. There has been research that also indicated that not only beta sheet hydrogen bonding occurs and disulfide linkages, but also tyrosine cross-linking. And it turned out that this is the third mechanism or bonding mechanism that aids in the formation of gluten network. So tyrosine cross-linking, this paper here is also under reading material on Canvas. They found that what happens is tyrosine can get oxidized and forming a radical, and then you will have two radicals of tyrosine that will eventually form a bond. And then that would be a dityrosine crosslink. They proved this by running different analytical mass spec data to show the mass changes once they have a monomer of tyrosine versus a dityrosine. They did that using one amino acid under conditions that are similar to dough making. So they have proven that this is an oxidation that can also occur in dough. They also further proved that if you add oxidizing agent like potassium bromate, enhances this mechanism. However, when we add reducing agent, it kind of blocks it. So reducing agents such as cysteine, glutathione, or BHT, antioxidant, so which is a reducing agent, it reduces this cross-linking because it's based on oxidation. They also thought that this is also an enzyme mediated due to the presence of naturally occurring peroxidase in the flour. So when they extracted peroxidase from the flour, the water-soluble component from the flour, and they added proteases to break it down, and they put it back in the flour, and then the tyrosine cross-linking did not occur. So they proved that the presence of peroxidase actually aided in the formation of tyrosine linkages. And then they went on debating whether this is the more driving force for the formation of gluten versus disulfide linkages versus beta sheet. So the debate is still there, but the belief right now is there are different mechanisms. They are, of course, the beta sheet plays an important role, and then disulfide and as well as tyrosine. So these are the three mechanisms for gluten matrix formation. And this is the illustration of the chemical bonds that happen. This is a newer paper, and I think it's a review, I'm not quite sure. But this here shows you the hydrogen bonding to form the beta sheet, the disulfide linkages, and then the tyrosine linkage as well. And of course here it's showing the importance of hydration, the presence of water that would facilitate the unfolding of the protein and start the formation of these different bonding, and hence the formation of gluten. Now, what's the role of glass transition? We talked about it briefly at the beginning. In order for the gluten to form, the protein has to be flexible and a flowable state. So we need to cross the glass transition temperature. It can be impacted by water. So if we have high water content, the glass transition can be as low as 16 to 18 degrees. But at room temperature, the glass transition can occur if the moisture content is at 13%. And that is specific for wheat protein. So again, this is restating that upon the mixing of the dough and the development of the dough, we start having the beta sheet formation, and the gluten maintains the structure over time, and this structure allows gives the elasticity to the dough and allows it from collapsing, prevent it from collapsing upon baking. So this is the formation of beta sheet is a very important characteristic that is directly related to the elasticity of the dough and the stability of the dough upon baking, the stability of the structure upon baking. And the formation of beta sheet has to do with the high molecular weight subunits and the regular spacing of glutamine residues. So the glutamine residues are the driving forces for the formation of beta sheet. So, and the water plays an important role. So if you start, I don't know if you notice, when you put water on your flour and start to forming the dough, the first thing you feel is sticky. But as you continue to knead it, then it becomes less sticky because the water is absorbed. It's now part of the structure of the gluten. It's absorbed by the starch as well as the protein. So continued mixing makes the dough smooth and elastic. However, if you overmix, the dough becomes extensible and sticky. So you really want to get to that optimum development time of the dough and stop mixing after you reach the optimum consistency. So the important characteristic of the dough is basically extensibility. So you want your dough to extend, but at the same time, you don't want it to just flow. So you want some resistance to extension, and that would be your elasticity. You need mixing tolerance so that it does not break and become sticky very quickly. And you want the ability to enclose gas bubbles. So when you ferment your dough, and then when you bake it, you don't want the gas to be released, and then you will have a really flat volume, basically. So all of these characteristics are key to have a good and strong dough. Some of you might be familiar with this unit. It's a texture analyzer in Ted's lab, and we have a special rig. We call it the Kiefer rig here, that we use it for assessing the rheology of the dough. So this little piece here, it's a dough piece, and then this rig is pulling on the dough. And we take two measurements in here. One measurement is the extensibility, so we see how far we can pull it before it breaks, and then we measure the extensibility in distance unit. And then when it breaks, we measure the force that it took to break that dough. So obviously, the longer it can elongates before it breaks, that's a good property. And the higher the force, that's also good indication of resistance, good resistance to stretching, or what we call it, elasticity. So, few questions to think about. How would reagents such as reducing agents or agents that promote disulfide linkages and thiol blockers, that means reagents that blocks thiols or sulfider groups, affect dough structure? So how would, let's take it one by one, how would the reducing agent impact the dough? Yeah?
If there were any bonds formed, it would just break them again. So
Yeah.
you just never end up building up like the elasticity.
Exactly. So it becomes more viscous, less elastic. So if you have a really strong dough and you want to use that dough for pita bread, you don't want it to be elastic. You want it to be more extensible. You want that bread to spread out and not shrink back and becomes thick. You really want a nice thin pita bread. So when you roll the dough, you want it to be more extensible. So if you have really strong, hard dough or flour from hard wheat, you can add a little bit of reducing agent to break down that elasticity. On the other hand, if you have not so strong of a flour and you want to form a bread that has really nice volume, so it's not extend, it just when it is being baked and you generate that volume, you want good strengths that the gases don't escape, just to be held within that structure and form a nice volume, loaf volume. In this case, you want to ensure that you have enough disulfide interchange. So in this case, you add an oxidizing agent like ascorbic acid, for example, or potassium bromide. Thiol blockers have the same impact as a reducing agent. Basically, they will react with the thiol group, and then they won't be reacting via disulfide linkages anymore. How would changes in Glycine to glutenin ratio affect viscoelasticity? We talked about it a little bit. So if we have higher Glycine to glutenin ratio, would that be better for loaf bread or pita bread? Pita bread, yeah. So higher Glycine is for extensibility, glutenin is for elasticity. So higher Glycine to glutenin ratio will end up with a lower volume for a loaf bread, and however probably a better pita bread. How would changes in the amount of high sulfur gliadins affect the dough strength? Well, if you don't have enough protein in general, if you have low protein in general, whether it's gliadin or glutenin, you're going to have lower quality dough. So you need those gliadins to interact with glutenins. And because gliadins have high sulfur, are high sulfur containing, they can promote disulfide interchange to form larger matrix. So they are important. However, omega gliadin does not have any sulfider groups. So it won't contribute to the formation of the polymer or the gluten matrix. This is to illustrate the rheological properties of the gluten. So what you see here is this is a gluten that contains both gliadins and glutenins. This is a gliadin fraction. You can see that there is no elasticity. It's very flowy. And this is the glutenin component of the gluten. So you can see it's very elastic. It won't extend. Together you have a really nice viscoelastic property. So you really need both of them. You don't want something very elastic and not flexible, and you don't want something that is very viscous. So studies that have done a lot of fractionation looked into the impact of gliadin and glutenin on different types of baked products. I can tell you when I was doing my master's, I focused on impact of gliadin to gluten ratio on pita bread. So what I did is I took the flour and broke it down into its components. So I took the fat out, the starch, the gluten, and then the gluten, I fractionated it into different components, gliadins and glutenin, and also within each, there are also different components, the high molecular weight glutenins and the low molecular weight glutenins, and the different components of gliadins. There were 9 different fractions. And then I put back the flour together. I created different ratios and then baked pita bread, a lot of pita bread. And then determine the impact of the different components of the protein on the functionality and the quality of the bread. So a lot of fractionation. It was exciting, at least to me. So there are different ways of extracting the wheat gluten. The traditional way, which I used in my thesis, is to just get the gluten protein out and then fractionate the gluten protein to different fractions. But what you do, you take the flour, you knead it in water and form your dough. And from there, you wash out the starch. So obviously I did that, so it took hours and hours of work of just to do that and get the gluten. And then the water, it didn't go down the drain for me. I collected all the water and freeze-dried it to get the starch so that I can reconstitute the flour. So anyway, it was a very interesting process, but here's your gluten. And you can take that gluten protein network and fractionate it as much as you want into different fractions using different solvents. But one way that is very common we do in our lab here to look at gluten forming protein components, what we do is we take the defatted flour. So basically the flour first, we defat it with an organic solvent, and then the defatted flour, we extract it with salt and water and centrifuge. The supernatant will contain our albumins and globulins. We discard that, and then we take the pellet and we solubilize the pellet in isopropanol and BME, which is a reducing agent, and we add acetic acid to acidify and enhance the solubility. And centrifuge, the pellet will get most of the starch, and the supernatant will have your glutenin and gliadin, or the prolamins. What we do, which I don't have here, sometimes if we want to separate the gliadins from glutenin, and oftentimes we do that, so we can determine the ratio of gliadin to glutenin, we extract with isopropanol alone, and then centrifuge and take the pellet. The supernatant will get the gliadin, and the pellet we will have mostly the glutenin and the starch yet. So we add to the pellet, we add more isopropanol, BME, and acetic acid, solubilize the glutenin, and the starch will precipitate. This way we can separate albumins, globulins, gliadins, and glutenins. And then obviously we run on the gel, and here are your different components of the gluten-forming proteins. So the impact, again, here is illustrating the impact of gliadin to glutenin ratio, where in a loaf bread, you really like to have this large volume. You want more of glutenin, less of gliadin, so lower gliadin to glutenin ratio. Whereas if you're forming a pita bread, you want it to extend and not shrink back. And here you don't want a volume, because what happens here is your air is expand, and then it will form a pocket. And when it expands like that, and you will have a pocket, and thus you can make a sandwich, falafel sandwich.
So the previous slide was about extracting wheat gluten. Is that what they do in industry to make just like vital wheat gluten?
This is exactly what they do, but on a very large scale. Actually, when I went to Vilvoorde and they took me with Cargill, I visited the R&D facility, and they actually took me to one of the facilities in the Netherlands that produces gluten, vital gluten, and it's exactly that. But big machines are doing it for you. Yeah. So corn protein, the main protein in corn is zein. And there are different types of it. Alpha zein is the most abundant, and it represents about 70% of the total protein. And it's a very hydrophobic protein. It has a very high percentage of hydrophobic residues, mainly leucine, proline, alanine, and phenylalanine. So it's a really insoluble protein as well. It has an alpha helix structure and beta turn. Beta turn is this kind of structure over here, is known as beta turn structure, and has quite a bit of random coil as a remaining structure. So not much of a beta sheet. They exist mostly in corn in protein bodies. However, if they are taken out of the protein bodies, they can contribute to better dough properties, and they can form a good, if you add them to a wheat or sorghum composite, they would form a decent dough. So there has been research by a group at Purdue that studied the zein protein quite a bit, and then they were able to find that the formation of a viscoelastic protein network require higher temperature. So reaching glass transition for zein protein is higher than gluten protein. So for that, they looked at different temperatures, and they found that the glass transition temperature is 28 degrees if you have moisture greater than 20%. So remember, with gluten-forming proteins, we needed room temperature for only 13%. So here, in order to reach a viscoelastic state, you need a higher temperature, higher moisture content. So they were able to form a stable, somewhat stable viscoelastic protein matrix in a dough when they use these conditions. However, zein lacks high molecular weight prolamine. So what happens to the structure? It crumbles. So when you bake it, the structure is no longer stable. It doesn't form a stable beta sheet. So when they did the study, actually, Maya et al. From a group from Purdue, when they did this study, they did FTIR and looked at the secondary structure during fermentation of the dough, and then they saw that the beta sheet structure is not stable. It transforms into alpha helix and random coil. And that led to, when once baked, a structure crumbles. You don't have the elasticity that maintains the structure and allows the holding of the gas. But baking properties can be improved if this is an example where they used zein dough and they added a hydrocolloid, Hpmc, added to it, so it helped with the formation it helped with holding water and gel formation. So basically it helped with forming a better bread. So zein alone doesn't form a good bread. It crumbles, it loses stability. However, if we add something to it like a hydrocolloid, it helps. And here's again the example you've seen before. You can enhance the property of rice dough into bread. Rice is also low in high molecular weight prolamine like protein, so it's really low in this protein that is needed for elasticity. So, but if we add transglutaminase, which is an enzyme that catalyzes the polymerization of lysine, amine group of lysine, and the carboxyamide group of glutamine, to form a covalent linkage. Enhance the polymerization will enhance the properties of rice bread. This is another study we've done in the lab. We'll talk about it a little bit and then give you a break in 5 minutes. So this is a grain, intermediate wheatgrass. It's a grain related to wheat, but it's not really wheat. It has proteins that are also gliadins and glutenins. So running an ELISA, it shows that intermediate wheatgrass does have the protein that generates immunoreactivity. So it's not a gluten-free product or grain. However, when we extracted the gluten components or the gluten proteins and then ran them on a gel, you can see here, here's your regular wheat protein. Here is your intermediate wheatgrass, and these are different varieties. So intermediate wheatgrass protein, and then this is the wheat protein. What the striking difference? What is the striking difference that you notice? You know that from our lab. Did you hear what she said? Okay, so they are deficient in high molecular weight glutenins. So you can see here there are some high molecular weight glutenins, but they are not as abundant as they are in wheat. So we looked at the secondary structure. How would that impact the secondary structure distribution of the protein within the dough? So we looked at the secondary structure of the flour and then of the dough. And just to remind you, we covered that in the protein analysis section. We did FTIR, and amide 1 gives us, when you deconvolute the peak, gives us the different secondary structures. So beta sheet, random coil, alpha helix, and beta churn. So looking at the amide 1 region. And we also ran the dough. Of course, this is the water peak. So luckily our amide region is here, away from the water peak, so we were able to interpret that peak. And then we looked at the different components of the secondary structure. So 0% intermediate wheatgrass, that means all hard red wheat. We used regular wheat flour. And then we mixed it at 50%, 75%, and 100%, that means no wheat was added. So you can see if we're looking at beta sheet, the beta sheet concentration decreased with higher intermediate wheatgrass content. That is directly related to the less amount of high molecular weight glutenins. And then also random coil was higher when we had intermediate wheatgrass in there. So, but the main observation is the beta sheet decreases, or the trend decreases with the higher inclusion of that type of grain flour. We did size exclusion Hplc, and this is another reminder to how to use the different analytical skills to explain the structure to function. So we looked at the distribution of the gliadin versus the high molecular weight polymeric proteins. So in hard red wheat, if you look at the ratio of the gliadins to the high molecular weight polymeric protein compared to intermediate wheatgrass, forget about all of these different varieties. You see here you have higher percentage of high molecular weight polymeric protein, so the ratio to gliadin to glutenin here versus here, there's a difference. So this has higher gliadin to glutenin ratio than hard red wheat. So that explains that too. And then looking at albumins and globulins, you have higher albumins and globulins in intermediate wheatgrass than you have in wheat. So the protein most of the protein here is coming from albumins and globulins as well, not only the gluten-forming proteins. So that explained also a little bit why the functionality is different. we ran farinograph. So to determine the dough development time and the dough strength and the stability, dough stability. So this is intermediate wheatgrass, this is hard red wheat. I should probably update them with our most up-to-date data. But you can see here, this is the 500 Brabender unit line. So this indicates really strong wheat flour and stable, so it doesn't leave the 500 Brabender unit line very easily, whereas the intermediate wheatgrass reaches the 500 Brabender unit line and breaks very quickly, and it's not as strong as the hard red wheat, and it did not absorb as much water. It was very sticky dough. Yeah, it was a sticky mess. And in terms of bread, here's your bread flour, regular white bread flour versus whole flour, and here are our tiny intermediate wheatgrass. So relating again the protein to the rheology to the baking. But it was good in terms of a cake and a cookie. Now, don't ask me about taste, but that's a different story. All right, so that's that for cereal. I'll give you 5 minutes break and we will start a new topic. Yeah, but can you separate? Yeah, but can you separate it in such a way that I can cut the image? Yeah, like run all of your pea protein and the penny press and leave 2 lanes and run under reducing. I mean,
we're gonna run the penny press, or we're gonna run pea flour and then the 2 proteins, and then I have the meal and then my 3 proteins, and then we have the microwave marker. But then if we do reducing and non-reducing, we won't have enough lanes.
Anyway, I prefer that you do the reducing on a different gel,
Okay.
so that you don't have BME on the same gel. That might mess up your gel. So you can run both of your samples on one non-reducing gel and then both of your samples on a reducing gel.
Perfect.
Yeah. That's good. And it's recorded.
What?
And it's recorded in the lecture.
Sorry, we're done.
Yeah.
So we already discussed that alpha prime have higher surface hydrophobicity, but you only say that they are present on the exterior. How does that work?
Because they have also hydrophobicity.
Phobicity, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And also, like, I had also prepared the diagram for the soy protein, but I forgot to send it to you. The one that you mentioned last time.
Well, if it's the same as Nina's, then she beat you. Send me what you have.
Yeah.
And I'll see.
Also, so you asked me to reschedule the meeting, but then don't we have a lab meeting on Monday?
We don't. It's cleaning day. So I moved it from my calendar. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Fran, do you have your
Is that the last one?
That's the last one. Next week is the exam. She's looking at me like I don't like you. Huh?
The final's the 11th. I thought that's the exam we were talking about. I was like,
Oh no, it's the take-home exam.
calendar's not that far out.
And why is it on a Saturday at 8 a.m.?
My brother's graduation is the night before.
Isn't it? Or do you want to do it before the?
No. I mean, all the time I can get.
I'm just saying, if you're graduating. Who's graduating? You're graduating?
She's not taking the final.
Yeah, but you are graduating now?
She's walking.
You're just walking, but you're graduating. It's like, why are you graduating? You just started. Okay. We're missing Lisa still, but we'll get going. All right. So this is the last topic. Kind of my favorite topic, protein modification. Now you're going to say, you say that for every topic. I'm very glad I don't have to teach eggs again, egg proteins. That was my least favorite topic. Because I don't have examples on egg proteins. I didn't personally work with egg protein. Okay. All right, so going back to this map, where we're kind of summing up, we talked about intrinsic factors, how they impact protein structure. We talked about environmental factors and processing, environmental factors, pH, temperature, salt, processing, then mostly temperature, and how that impacts protein structure going from native to denatured, and then how the structure, once it's impacted, how that impacts protein functionality. And then we talked about different protein sources and how there are different in structure and different in function. So what is left to talk about is how modifying the protein structure by different mechanisms will impact functionality. So that is our next and last topic. So recap from what we learned on structure and function relationship. So if you have a globular native protein with low surface hydrophobicity, and in this example I put beta-lactoglobulin there. Forget about the better, a good emulsifier, a good gelling agent. What do you select out of these? Sarah, do you, not Sarah, Lisa, do you have your extra credit?
No.
Okay. So what do you think? Does it have good solubility? Does it have reduced overall functionality? Reduced digestibility? What does it have? Good solubility. Out of all of this, good solubility. What else? Would it have low or high digestibility? Usually a globular protein, compact protein, is not as digestible as an open structured protein. Okay. It needs, in this case, whey protein, when it's denatured, partially denatured, it becomes very digestible. All right, this is a partially denatured protein, so I just answered one of them. Improved digestibility. What else? Go ahead, Mike.
Emulsifier is a better.
Better emulsification. Yeah, better emulsifier. What about, what else? Yeah?
Better gelling.
Better gelling, because now we're exposing hydrophobic groups and we're exposing the disulfide sulfider groups for disulfide bonding.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
About just the terminology of reduced overall functionality. So what are you classifying that as? Because it could be like a bad emulsifier, but a good gelling agent.
When I
or-
say reduced overall functionality, I mean everything got bad.
Okay.
Denatured and polymerized, everything got bad. So when you have denatured protein that is polymerized in a way that it's really aggregated and precipitated rather than polymerized in a, and here I don't mean polymerized in a good three-dimensional gel. And what I mean here is it got denatured, it polymerized, formed aggregates, and the aggregates are large and fall out of solution. So in this case, reduced solubility, reduced overall functionality. What about digestibility? Reduced digestibility. You're forming a big blob that is not digestible. Yeah.
So if it's possible, you get the better emulsifier, but worse gelling agent after you modify.
After yes, depending on the modification that you actually do and depending on the protein itself. So you don't always improve one thing and improve everything else with it. Sometimes you improve one thing and another characteristic is either stays the same or deteriorates. So it really depends on the type of protein and type of modification. Here is really a very general overview of what happens when it's partially denatured, what happens when it aggregates.
What did you say for partially denatured?
For partially denatured, you have improved emulsification and improved gelation potentially. Because with opening up of the structure, especially of a beta-lactoglobulin, you are now exposing hydrophobic groups. Initially, you have very high hydrophilicity, so that is not good for an emulsifier. And then gelation, because for gelation to occur, you need the protein to be denatured so that it interacts and then form disulfide linkage. Again, you don't want it to polymerize. It depends on your heating rate and the environmental conditions that will promote the formation of a gel rather than a sediment and an aggregate. Yes?
So if you were to like freshly denature a pea protein with like UHT or something, would you have age gelation issues? Potentially?
Potentially, yes. With any denatured protein, you will eventually have age gelation. So you denature the pea protein and put it in a beverage, and you put it on the shelf. Eventually, yes.
Okay.
The mode of breakage or failure would be the sedimentation.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. So I want to just elaborate a little bit on any processed beverage, your protein is going to be denatured. Well, even whey protein. So whey protein will be denatured. Therefore, there's always this shelf life before your protein sediments out of solution. And it really depends on the protein inclusion level, how much protein you have in the system. It really depends on the stabilizer you have in the system as well, because you add stabilizers to your beverages. And therefore, on the type of protein too. Then this would depend, say, this protein beverage is stable for 3 weeks or 6 weeks or 12 weeks on the shelf. It really all depends on what's in there and the type of protein. That's why modification is important, because one big issue that I'll talk about in this lecture or next lecture is the problem of industry having short shelf life for protein beverages.
So does that mean like the protein shakes that athletes use like have a lower benefit since the protein's denatured and it's less digestible?
Say that again.
Like if the protein's denatured and the protein shakes that like athletes use, is it so it's less digestible to them? So does that account for that in the nutrition label? Like do they have a separate PDCAS on that?
Well, you would hope, but if they get to a point where you use it after the shelf life, so if you use it within the shelf life that they claim that they don't have a precipitate or they don't form an aggregate, because they should have tested that within this whatever shelf life is of these shakes, the protein is not an aggregate. So if it's an aggregate, then the digestibility will be reduced.
Okay.
So the shelf life should account for that.
Okay.
If they do that or they don't, that's a different story. Did you say the name of the company?
No.
Okay.
That's wondering.
Yeah. All right. So this brings me to why do we consider protein modification? Let's talk a little bit of why is this an important topic, and why do you think it's a route that people are considering or industry is considering? Yes.
Allergen.
Allergen. Okay, great. Do you see any successful product in the market that has reduced allergenicity?
Or I'm not sure if I'm looking at for those products in the market myself,
But have you heard of any successful hypoallergenic product?
not yet.
There's one. Or a category.
Pets.
Huh?
Pets.
For pets. No, I wasn't thinking of pets. I was thinking of infant formulas. Poor infants. So they have a really hydrolyzed whey protein hydrolysis, for example, in their product. So they consume it. It tastes horrible, but babies, can they tell you and object? You can cry, but you can still force feed them. But there is no human food, adult food, that has a hypoallergenic protein ingredient as of yet. Because flavor is bad, functionality is bad. A protein to be hypoallergenic, you have to destroy over 90% of the epitopes. Or the epitopes, that means the regions of the protein that are immunoreactive. And to destroy 90% of these epitopes, we are destroying the entire protein. We're basically turning it into amino acid and tripeptides or whatever it is. So you are really destroying the protein, so it won't gel, it won't emulsify, it would taste horrible, so we won't use it in a product. So there's a lot of research on hypoallergenization and yet no success. We included done research on hypoallergenization of soy protein. It did not work, so I quit.
Can breathing can help that?
Breathing, there's a lot of effort also to breathe, but it's so hard because you're changing the entire protein itself. And again, you cannot do it without GMO, and it becomes a GMO, and it's another problem. But the consumer problem. Yeah. And the problem with protein, so even if we do genetic modification, even if we change the protein so that it doesn't have these epitopes, once you expose the people to these new proteins, they will eventually form immuno reaction to it. That's why now we say we're so happy pea protein is not one of the big 8, but soon it will be. There's a lot of exposure to pea protein right now. So it's coming up there with allergenicity. And all other proteins will follow. So that's the nature of proteins. Okay, so why do we want to consider modification? I want to go back to Becky's question about the protein and shelf life and sedimentation. So even whey protein, the protein that is known to be the golden standard for protein beverages, they also still promote. So originally Davisco, now is Agripur. They kept pushing for research for thermal stability of whey protein and to use it to extend the shelf life of beverages. This continues to be a problem because even whey protein that is soluble, once it's denatured, it's going to aggregate gradually and then precipitate, and then the consumers don't want to see a precipitate in their beverage. So protein modification for this purpose is something that people are looking into to enhance solubility and thermal stability of the protein. What else? Other than allergenicity and other than that, can you think of another example or other examples? Yes?
Maybe like meat analogs, so if you're trying to take plant things and make it like the other kinds of proteins.
Yes, how can we make a protein that does not have the capability to form a certain structure that is desirable in meat? How can we make it form that? How can we extrude a protein to make it have these similar texture to meat? Yes, so meat analogs, not just meat analogs, dairy analogs, so cheeses, plant protein-based cheeses. Now a big thing is plant protein, right? They don't function very well. They're horrible, most of them. So we want to make them functional. We want to use plant protein, but whey protein is always better than any of the plant protein out there. How can we make plant protein soluble? How can we make it gel better, emulsify better, so that it can compete in the market with other traditional proteins? So protein modification. Okay. So ways to modify the proteins. There's so many different ways. The most common and industry utilized way is enzymatic modification. Obviously, there are other ways. Originally, the traditional or the old-fashioned way is chemical modification. I'll talk about it briefly, but in the US, it's not allowed, mostly banned, to use chemicals to modify protein. But it kind of formed a basis of knowledge of protein structure and relation to functionality. So I'll talk about it a little bit. Physical modification, this is an area that's been explored. High pressure treatment, for example, is a physical modification that is being looked at. Maillard glycation. There's a lot of research over the past 10-15 years looking at glycating protein and looking at changes in structure and impact on functionality. A lot of research has been done in this area, a lot of it on whey protein, and I've done some of that as well. I'll share with you some of these results. However, there is no ingredient in the market yet produced as glycated protein. Still a lot of innovation that needs to happen in that space. Biotechnology, by a genetic modification, you can basically do anything. You can modify the protein structure in any way you like. It's definitely not one of the go-to approaches to modify, given the GMO problem, potential problem. Others, what do you think, Fan is here? Cold plasma is one. Fan is working on cold plasma modification, and we'll be presenting on that next week. So yeah, so we have all these different methods of modification, and the purpose of it is really to improve functionality, enhance nutritional delivery, meaning enhance digestibility and accessibility to the amino acids, nutrients, nitrogen, and delivery of physiological benefits, and that's mostly with the bioactive peptides. So when you produce the hydrolysate, we are also producing peptides that would resist further digestion in our body and will give us physiological benefits. One big one that I worked on is antihypertensive activity, and I'll give you some examples on that as well. But whatever you do, you have to always ensure that methods of modification are safe. You don't have side effects. You don't have potential toxic metabolite that could be generated. You don't degrade some of your amino acids. So that is why chemical modification is crossed out mostly in the US. It's not commonly used globally. And also, that's why whenever we want to look at a new method, like if we want to really consider Maillard glycation, how do we want to make sure that it does not produce the Maillard end products, the advanced glycation end product that could be carcinogens. So, for example, or if we use biotechnology, what else are we changing in the crop or the material that might have negative impact? If we're using cold plasma, what are we generating that could have toxic impact on us? So whatever method we follow, we have to make sure that it is safe in order for it to be adapted in industry. So far, enzymatic modification is safe because we're using enzymes that are GRAS, and conditions of hydrolysis are usually safe within pH that is acceptable range, temperature. So that's why it is industrially feasible and applied. A lot of hydrolysates are out there as an ingredients in the market.
Will those have to be declared on the label with BISMA?
Effect?
Will the enzymes have to be declared?
So enzymes are usually processing aids, so they are not really put on the label. As long as the enzymes are GRAS, they have the GRAS. You have to choose an enzyme with the GRAS approved. Yeah. So I have a few slides on chemical modification just to give you an example of what these are. So with the chemical modification, what has been targeted is physicochemical changes. That means we are changing physicochemical characteristics of the protein. These physicochemical characteristics can be changed in charge. So either increasing the charge density by adding a charged group, and that will lead to enhanced solubility, or doing the opposite, decreasing the net charge. That means we are changing the balance of hydrophobic to hydrophilic. That could help in enhancing foaming or enhancing emulsification. Changing hydrophobicity, either you increase the hydrophobicity or decrease the hydrophobicity. So increasing polarity, that means decreasing hydrophobicity. You can add a sugar molecule, a small weight carbohydrate, or you can add a long chain hydrocarbon or anhydride. So you can increase the hydrophobicity of your protein by attaching such a group. Change in size, you can cross-link proteins, like when we did with the rice bread, transglutaminase, or you can do ethylation reaction. That means you add a thiol group. If you add thiol groups, you promote polymerization by disulfide. Hydrolysis can be done by alkali or acid hydrolysis. So you can also break down the protein into smaller size and enhance solubility. So all of these changes can impact different functionalities. Of course, with everything, there's advantages and disadvantages. So the advantages, you get a desirable change. That's good. Easy to implement and cheap. So it's not a complicated thing to do. However, there are some disadvantages. Not all amino acids are reactive, so they won't react in all the different chemical reactions that you're trying to induce. So, and it's not specific, so it does not target a certain location on the protein. Possible production of toxic metabolites. Deterioration of quality, that means by blocking essential amino acid. I'll give you an example about some of the chemical reactions that target lysine. And it's sometimes reversible, so it's not permanent change. Okay. So, modification of amino groups, and under this the example is acylation, and under acylation we have acetylation and succinylation. Acetylation is adding an acetic anhydride. So reacting an acetic anhydride reacts with the amine group of the amine terminus of a protein or a peptide. So it's basically blocking a potentially positive charge. So it's increasing the net negative charge of the protein. Not adding a charge, blocking a charge, blocking a positive charge that result in a net negative charge. So basically, this will impact solubility, so we might see a slight improvement in solubility, as well as has been shown that it enhances slightly the emulsification properties. Succinylation, again, it reacts with lysine. I think here I didn't mention it, the target here is lysine. Here it reacts with lysine, also histidine, tyrosine, and also some aliphatic hydroxyl and sulfidyl groups. So lysine, but others as well. And here the succinic anhydride react with the amine group, and then this is adding in a negative charge. There is a carboxyl group potentially that can ionize it. So we're adding a charge. So we're adding an anionic succinate residue to the group, to the amine group. So enhances solubility and thermal stability. It has been done with whey protein, and it showed that we have an enhanced solubility and thermal stability. And also when the protein is denatured, we have high hydrophobicity, but as well with some hydrophilicity, we saw improvement in emulsification and foaming. And these are some of the applications that it has been used. However, it was also done to reduce, with enhancing thermal stability, it reduced aggregation of whey protein in certain applications where you don't want the whey protein to aggregate. So in comparison, so acetylation, there is the lysine residue. Here we have lysine and other residues. It's a covalent attachment of neutral acetyl group. Here is we are adding a negatively charged group, not neutral, negatively charged, so there is more net charge here. And then here a more enhanced solubility than succinylation, more enhanced solubility than acetylation. But both will lead to loss of lysine, and it has been shown to lead in reduced digestibility as well. So in terms of side effects. Okay. Other chemical modification is when we have the reduction or oxidation of sulfidyl groups. So reducing disulfide linkages and promoting disulfide linkages, either or. So you can do that by adding the reducing agent like glutathione or cysteine can be added to break the disulfide. Mostly this is done on analytical scale where we want to reduce to run in gel, for instance, so we can see the different banding, or if we're doing size exclusion chromatography and we want to see the different subunits, you might want to reduce as well. So it is used for analytical purposes. It can be used in food processing as well, and that example is using ascorbic acid to oxidize disulfide or promote oxidation in dough systems. So that is an example of doing that.
How does it affect the nutritional value of the protein?
When you reduce?
When we do any chemical modification?
Well, if you induce polymerization, for example, you reduce digestibility. If you block a lysine group, you reduce the availability of lysine. So it could be that way. Yeah, polymerization or reduction or degradation of an essential amino acid. Sulfites are also reducing agents, so what they do is they react with a disulfide group and they form a free thiol and also a sulfonate, S-sulfonate. So that means you can't form a disulfide anymore, so you take away a thiol group. It was shown to improve forming properties in whey protein because it broke the disulfide linkages, so the protein became more flexible, and then it formed better film around the air bubbles. And it is a reversible modification. So ascorbic acid, we gave that, it has so many functions in food, and it's used specifically in the redox, reducing, oxidizing process in the flour and bread improvement. Thiolation is adding a thiol group, so you react it with a chemical that has a sulfur, and when it reacts with the amine group of a protein, it breaks into this kind of structure and it gives you a free sulfide group. With having a free sulfide group, I'm adding the potential of it forming a polymer via disulfide linkages. And it shows in some cases you enhanced foaming or caused also an increase in net negative charge, same as succinylation and acetylation, because it's blocking a potentially positive amine group. Acid and alkali reaction. So acid and alkali can cause hydrolysis, breaking down into smaller peptides. So you can generate lower molecular weight products, higher ionizable groups, better solubility. It's used under mild conditions to extract protein, under alkaline condition, pea extraction, soy protein extraction, acidify your beverage to make it acidic, it becomes probably more soluble in certain situations, enhancing emulsification, lower viscosity. So these are different impacts. And also hydrolysis can, or acid and alkali reaction can cause deamidation, that means conversion, in this case, of asparagine to aspartic acid, glutamine to glutamic acid. So alkali reaction, severe or intense alkali condition can cause destruction of some amino acid, including lysine, which is an essential amino acid, and you might end up forming a non-digestible product like the lyso and adenine. Last one on chemical modification is you can glycosylate or phosphorylate. Same with post-translational modification. You can induce glycosylation, induce phosphorylation. That means adding a group, a covalently linked group, a carbohydrate group here or a phosphate group here. For adding glycosylation, you have a decreased positive charge, potentially an increased negative charge, and change in shape, configuration of the protein. Here we're adding a negative charge, and this enhances different characteristics of the protein as well. But here again in the state, we don't do either of these modifications. So with this, I will move on to the most common modifications, which is the enzymatic modification. Yeah.
What happens to the byproducts after chemical modifications?
What happens to
The byproducts, does it just get discarded or reused anywhere?
the byproduct?
Yeah, like once you use like the chemicals to modify.
I'm not sure if it's used up in the reaction itself, if they're added just to use it up. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's all.
yeah. Do you know of any example? Are you thinking
Well,
of
I was
something?
thinking like in starch modifications or byproduct, they just throw away all the chemicals, or it just gets discarded, which is like a.
As another hazard.
Yeah.
Yeah. If they do that, then that's another hazard. But anyway, we don't do protein modification with chemical in this country.
Okay. Yeah.
Probably that's one of the reasons. Yeah. All right. So protein modification by enzyme. We talked about use of enzymes for cheese formation and meat tenderization using propane or bromelain. Gluten modification, we talked about it a little bit also previously, is if the gluten is too strong or the gluten forming proteins are too strong, you can break down the high molecular weight glutenins, then you can potentially make the resultant dough less elastic. We talked about the enzymes that are involved in cross-linking, like the transglutaminase. So these are all examples that are used for enzyme modification for a specific type of product. But the enzyme modification that I'll focus on a little bit more is the actual production of a protein hydrolysate ingredient. Because we want to improve the functionality of a protein ingredient for a particular application. The other is the protein modification that here is basically used for a product. So to form a cheese, we add an enzyme. To make the meat tender, we add the enzyme to break down a little bit the protein in meat. Gluten, to make a certain type of baked product, we make the gluten protein less elastic, we break it down. To form a polymer, we add this. But protein hydrolysis, to change protein structure, to impact function, it's mostly for a protein ingredient. So that's where I'm going to focus a little bit more, which is the production of hydrolysates that are used as ingredients. So we have the protein sequence, the sequence of amino acid and the parent protein. And we take that protein and we go, okay, we want to break it down via enzymatic hydrolysis to produce peptides. And you can't imagine the different conditions, the infinite number of conditions that one can use, and the infinite number of enzymes that one can use that would produce an infinite types of products. So you can generate hundreds of different products by using a handful of enzymes under different conditions. Because pH is going to change the way the protein is ionized. Temperature is going to impact protein structure. Salt, if we add salt, is also going to impact ionization. So the enzyme, when it comes and breaks, is going to be impacted by the structural changes of the protein under these different conditions. So conditions, enzyme specificity, even with the same type of protein, is going to result with peptides of different functionalities. So the same protein, change the enzyme, or keep the enzyme the same and change one condition, you'll end up with a different set of hydrolysate. So you can control this hydrolysis, whether it's the enzyme type or the conditions or the starting protein, denatured protein or native protein. Because if you're starting with denatured protein, you're also going to get a different set of peptides because the enzyme will have access to different binding sites. Okay, so the nature of the protein, the different conditions, the different enzymes, many different outcomes. So some peptides could be more hydrophobic, aggregate promoters. Some peptides could be more hydrophilic, you get more solubility. Some peptides, based on their size and the ratio of hydrophobic to hydrophilic components in these peptides, they become a better emulsifier. The size of the peptides also is very important. You can hydrolyze the protein but end up with really very small peptides. They won't emulsify, they won't gel for you. But if you break them down in a certain way that they are of a certain size and certain hydrophobicity and hydrophilicity, you might improve gelation, improve emulsification. Sometimes you hydrolyze and you can also produce sequences, unique sequences, especially those that have proline in them, that has bioactive characteristics. So, in general, a hydrolysate has enhanced digestibility. Why? Because the protein has been chopped down into smaller peptides. And also the breaking of peptides can result in unfolding of the protein as well. Because you're breaking bonding, when you break certain peptides and remove certain residues, you change the secondary and tertiary structure so that the protein might overall become more accessible to digestive enzyme. You can get reduced allergenicity. To what level is dependent on how much you hydrolyzed. You hydrolyzed a lot, or you hydrolyzed to decrease allergenicity by 50%. So ultimately, you can break down some epitopes that would result in reduced allergens. Improved functionality, it really depends, like I explained, it depends on the characteristics of the generated peptide, but often hydrolysis is targeted to enhance functionality. So if you look at the ADM website and try to look at their ingredients list, they have tons, maybe 20 different soy protein hydrolysate or soy protein ingredient. So they did a lot of trials and did different enzymatic hydrolysis conditions to result with different types of hydrolysis, and they tell you this is for enhanced viscosity, this is for enhanced gelation, this is for enhanced emulsification. So there is not one recipe for all. So there is not one type of hydrolysate that will have all sorts of improved functionality. And enhanced bioactivity by releasing bioactive peptide that could have several physiological benefits. Enzymatic modification in general, as I said, has an advantage over chemical modification. First of all, it's more specific. It won't result in any toxic metabolite, and you can get rid of the enzyme by inactivating them. They won't stay in your system. Unless you use also immobilized enzymes, where you have your enzyme immobilized on a membrane, in a chamber, and then you run your protein solution in there, and then it comes out and the enzyme is still immobilized and reusable, which is more efficient. So here's just showing the specificity of the enzyme, that it can target certain areas and release peptides that could be bioactive in this case, and bioactive peptides often have proline, and the proline also, if it's present in the peptide, the peptide resists further digestion in the gut. So it would be absorbed as a peptide without further breaking into amino acids. So then you can get the bioactive or the physiological effect of it. If the peptide goes through and gets digested further by enzymes, then we don't absorb it as a peptide. We lose its physiological function. So, in general, to get enhanced digestibility, improved functionality, and enhanced bioactivity, we target minimal or limited hydrolysis. We often, in published research, you'll see the good ones. They would usually report the DH, and many of them control it to be anywhere between 3 to 8%. This control of the DH allows also to limit the perception of bitter peptides, because when you hydrolyze, you have tendency to there is a tendency to release peptides that could have a bitter taste, especially if peptides were rich in hydrophobic amino acids. Then the more you hydrolyze, the more of these peptides can be generated, and then the more the perception. But it's not always that. It's not always above 8% you're going to perceive bitterness. It also depends on the type of enzyme and the type of peptides released. But in general, low degree of hydrolysis is associated with acceptable taste, whereas high degree of hydrolysis is associated with potential bitter taste. And this is just a figure that illustrates that. It's relating bioactivity to bitterness. It's showing you here at a low degree of pH, you can see a difference. So you have really high bioactivity, but not so much bitterness. If you increase the degree of pH, you might not see that much increase in bioactivity, but there could be a significant increase in bitterness. I put reduced allergenicity here because you really need higher degree of hydrolysis to actually see a significant decrease in allergenicity. So when we produce hydrolysate, it's very important to control your hydrolysis. It's not like you just put the enzyme and just leave it an hour or two, it doesn't matter. No, we have to always control our conditions in order to achieve the desired outcome. So one thing we always control and look for is degree of hydrolysis, which is the number of peptides that are broken in the polypeptide chain. So it's the percentage of the total number of peptide bonds. So for every protein, there is an estimated total number of peptide bonds based on the number of amino acids. Then you would measure based on, there are different ways of measuring pH, but you could determine how many peptide bonds were broken, and you calculate percent DH as a percentage number. Enzymes that are used, proteinases or proteases that are used, vary in specificity. So they can affect the extent of hydrolysis and the type of peptides released. So we usually select proteases and proteinases based on what we know on the sequence of the protein and based on what we know about the enzyme itself. Where does it cut? Does it cut at a hydrophilic location? Does it cut at a hydrophobic location? Is it an exoprotease? Is it an endoprotease? What do we know about it? We select it based on that. So here's an example. I showed you this before when I was talking about soy protein gelation and emulsification. But just to remind you, here is on this further lane on the right is the soy protein extract. Next to it is a soy protein subjected to pepsin hydrolysis. Next to it is soy protein subjected to papain hydrolysis. You can see that the two different enzymes had two different selectivity. So the one that was digested with pepsin, the glycine component was digested and we had peptides generated. The one that was digested with papain had the beta-glycine digested and smaller peptides generated. So we selected, in this study, the papain was selected to cut off beta-glycan, and determine the impact on emulsification and gelation. And the other one was the same, to determine the impact on the same functionalities. Okay, now here it's showing you that this is the same study, soy protein, same enzymes. This is your soy protein and this is the two enzymes. Now I don't remember which is which. But the difference between here and here is the protein was denatured. So the soy protein here in this study was denatured. The soy protein here was native. So when the protein was denatured, we lost specificity. The protein opened up and the enzyme had access to multiple sites, so it did not select a certain subunit. It kind of lost its specificity. So this emphasizes that the extent of hydrolysis and the specificity is impacted by so many different conditions. One of them is the denaturation state of the protein. And again, like I said, what impacts the total percent of hydrolysis is also time. The longer we leave it, potentially it would hydrolyze more, unless it reaches a plateau when we have done the enzyme done what they could do. They can't hydrolyze anymore. They cut all at all the specific sites and they can't do anymore. Temperature impact based on the optimum temperature of the enzyme and how the temperature impact the protein structure, and pH, also the optimum for the enzyme and also how it would impact the ionization on the protein. So I will stop here and give you this example later on next week.